Tanchi. Hello, I'm Josh Nelson from Eastside Games, and we're super excited to support Imaginative's Digital Development Day this year. I'm Métis and from Willow River in northern BC, but I currently reside in Vancouver, which is on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Coast Salish peoples, Squamish, Stolo, Tsleil-Waututh, and Musqueam nations. Games tell unique and passionate stories, and I can't wait to see what you are building and how to bring that to the world. My team and I look forward to seeing what you create and sharing with you. Marcy, have a great festival.
I went to an audition. The casting director looked at me and she was just like, "Oh, you cut your hair. I used to call you Pocahontas." I froze. That in itself is a slur, and the real story of Pocahontas is one of rape and like molestation of children. So it's not a compliment. Seek more from our stories because there's so much more in the 500 plus Indigenous cultures across this country that we haven't seen in film and TV before.
Hello, Anin, and welcome to today's panel, Making Kin with the Machines, as part of our Indigenous Digital Development Day at the 2021 festival. Our conversation will be approximately an hour, so please leave your thoughts and comments in the chat for a little bit of a question and answer period afterwards. My name is Nikki Little. I am Anishinaabe from Garden Hill First Nation in northern Manitoba, and this is my third year as Artistic Director at Imaginative. I have medium brown hair and brown eyes. I am wearing black aviator glasses with a dark blue denim shirt on top. And I am sitting in a sunroom surrounded by windows on an overcast day with some plants and books in the background. Imaginative is located on present-day Toronto, the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, Huron-Wendat, and Mississaugas of the Credit. I invite you to please take a moment to think of the land you currently reside upon, wherever you may be, and acknowledge those who went before and those who have yet to come. On behalf of Imaginative and the festival, we'd like to thank our 2021 presenting partner, the Canada Media Fund. Today, I'm so honored to share space with some brilliant thinkers and makers today. So I have Dr. Jason Lewis, Suzanne Kite, and Archer Pechawis. I've gotten to know them all through their various practices throughout my career. I actually remember I met Jason and Archer early in my career at Imaginative and actually at Urban Shaman. Jason, I think I specifically remember your 2013 work, The World That Surrounds Us and Wants Your Death. And then Archer, I believe your work was in A Space Gallery in 2008 at Imaginative, where I brought a group of Indigenous youth actually to come see the exhibition. And I remember your drum there was just set up with different sounds and a media piece, and it was so engaging, and our youth just loved that piece so much and really resonated with them. And then Kite, I came across your work through the Banff Center and your commission piece, Everything I Say is True at the Walter Phillips Gallery. Today, our conversation is going to be grounded in the 2018 collective essay, Making Kin with the Machines, that was published through the Journal of Design and Science, a joint venture of the MIT Lab and MIT Press by the aforementioned artists, along with Noelani Arista. I encourage you all to give it a read, and we're going to drop it in the chat for you. So welcome, everyone. How is everyone today? Wonderful.
Happy to be here.
Happy to have you. And I was just wondering if we could perhaps start with a round of introductions. So I'll start with you, Archer.
Tanse Natotamak. Hello, my friends. Archer Pechawis, Nasikasun. My name is Archer Pechawis. My people come from Mistawasis Nehewak, which is a Plains Creek community in central Saskatchewan. I am a fair-skinned Indigenous man with very close-cropped black and gray hair. I am leaning against a very large willow tree. The sky behind me is overcast, but it's a beautiful day. I'm wearing a purple Leela Gilday t-shirt, which I'm very proud to be wearing, as Leela Gilday is so awesome. And I'm really happy to be here today.
Thank you.
Yes. Oh, yes, and I almost forgot. I have no visible piercings.
Amazing. I like how we have to just think beyond the screen. How about you, Suzanne?
Yeah, thank you for having me, Nikki. So I'll say Hamatakia P, Suzanne Kite Machia P Kashto, Los Angeles, Imataha, Nalahal Muskogee Creek Reservation, or Tulsa, Oklahoma, Najajage, LYTA. Oglala Hamacha, I'm Oglala Lakota, and I like to say Chante Washtea Nape Chiusapo. My relatives, they shake your hands with a happy heart. I am an Oglala Lakota woman. I have brown hair and blonde highlights and really big brown glasses. And I am, I can't believe you said your age before, Jay. I'm in my 30s. And I have a peyote tapes shirt on and I have a fake bookshelf behind me, so I look smarter. Thank you.
Amazing. And Jason, how about yourself?
Aloha, everybody. I am Jason Edward Lewis, and I am Hawaiian and Samoan. I was born and raised in Northern California, and there is an image of the river that I grew up next to, the North Fork of the Yuba River in Northern California, behind me in the Zoom window with a big sun up over my left shoulder and the river surrounding me and trees and so forth, lots of green behind me. I am wearing a black button-down t-shirt. I have a mustache and a beard, which are mainly white or gray at this point, and I'm wearing glasses, and I have no hair on the top of my head. And I think that's probably good enough for now.
Thank you and welcome everyone. I really appreciate you all being here again. And I would love to start with your practices individually and just sort of how, if you could discuss how it brought you to thinking about AI. And perhaps maybe I'll start with you, Kite.
My practice was primarily in music. I played violin. I started working with composition in college, and then I became interested in a type of composition called sonification, where that's taking data and turning it into sound. And I became interested in how my body could be involved in that process. And kind of through an exploration of what's called interfaces or music interfaces, body interfaces, instrument building, I started to think more about how I could develop tools that not only interact with the computer, but consider the computer's potential for decision making through tools like Wekinator. And I began to make hair braid interfaces and focus in on the possibilities proposed by the Aboriginal Territories in Cyberspace workshops, 7th generation character design, and thinking about what kind of tools we could be using in 7 generations. So from that, I think began to think about what the role of machine learning was to Indigenous thought, and then that led me to think about how Lakota ontologies or Lakota ways of being already include materials such as metal or stone. So it made sense to me to pursue kind of thinking along with my family and my community how we already consider these non-human beings as part of our relations, and that's kind of how I approach artificial intelligence and AI ethics.
Thank you. And how about you, Archer? If you can give us a little bit insight into your practice and your trajectory to AI.
I'll go backwards. I'd like to strongly echo what Kite was saying about the way we perceive non-human entities and how our relationships manifest in terms of neo-traditional thought and how these other beings are our relations. And in terms of my practice, I've been a performing artist / performance artist / live time-based artist for many decades. I'm particularly interested in the intersection of Plains Cree culture and millennial technology. Well, I guess it's 2021. I'll just say digital technology. I am very interested in how the digital and the spiritual can work together and how they work together and what those confluences are and how we can query them. And I'm very excited about the future. I have tremendous positivity and optimism about the future, even though we live in such, frankly, dreadful times. And my work is a huge part of why I'm optimistic. And the work that I do with Jason and with Suzanne is a big part of that. I think I'll finish there.
Thank you. And I really did like how the sound came up when you were talking about being a performance artist. There was this beautiful sound that kind of was happening at the same time. And how about yourself, Jason?
So I got here through a long history of trying to think about the intersections between digital network and computational technology and indigenous cultural practice, particularly around the arts. We started Aboriginal Territories in cyberspace in about 2005, and I worked in Silicon Valley for about a decade, and then moved here and started Aboriginal Territories in cyberspace. And the central question there was, how do we get more Indigenous people engaged with particularly digital network technology at that point? And that naturally led into questions of what does it mean to practice as an Indigenous person in these still relatively new spaces? And what does it mean to create Indigenous territory in cyberspace? Sort of all these issues around what can we do as Indigenous people to make these spaces and these tools our own? Sort of both push back against their histories, which are very much indebted to a Western military industrial academic complex, but also really think about how can we take advantage of the sort of immense power and opportunities that they provide to us. So I've been thinking about how do we talk about technology from an Indigenous standpoint for a long time, making artwork and developing technology on my own that in part engaged with those questions, mainly around interactive text and typography and digital poetry, electronic literature. And then Suzanne showed up and was talking about Lakota ontologies and how they might relate to tool making, particularly around performance practice. And we started a conversation around some directed readings that really kind of dug deeply into sort of not just Lakota ontologies, but ontologies from other Indigenous communities, and then particularly around what does it mean to talk about kinship, and what does it mean to talk about kinship with other than human and non-human. So these are all things that were that I had touched on here and there, but didn't particularly have a hugely grounded perspective from my cultures, Hawaiian and Samoan cultures. And so it started this journey of sort of really thinking about it, both in terms of, say, Suzanne's perspective or Archer's perspective as a Cree artist, but also from Hawaiian perspective. So those conversations are kind of what made it so that when Noe Arista, who's our fourth co-author, who is a historian at the time at the University of Hawaii in Manoa, she approached me to respond to this essay that was talking about AI and sort of the problems with AI. And that's when I in turn reached out and said, hey, this would be an amazing group to think about how to respond, like how might we talk about AI from Indigenous perspectives? And so it was really important to figure out how to write an essay that was cohesive, but also really clearly located, Suzanne talking about it as a Lakota person, not as the Lakota person, but as a Lakota person. Archer talking about it from a Cree perspective, and Noe talking about it from a Kanaka Maoli or Hawaiian perspective. So that's how I got there, and that sort of kicked off a bunch of other things.
I appreciate you giving us some insight into the background, especially around the relationality, I think, and how ideas started percolating and the journey to this collaborative essay, which was actually my first question to see if we can see how it was, or if you could give insight into how it was collaborating. I really do appreciate that multiplicity is really at the forefront and sort of stated at the onset of the essay, that the importance of that, and that you are not speaking from a whole community, like you're not the Indian speaking, but you're a part of many worldviews, which I think is so important. And I was curious if you can get into perhaps how it was like collaborating around such a very big idea, but also being able to articulate the nuances from your own personal perspectives. Perhaps, Kite, let's start with you.
Yeah, I mean, this essay, I'm very happy how successful it has been, because it was my first I think it was my first academic essay ever. So I really had no idea how to write it. And no idea I mean, what's also interesting is that we took an extremely, creative, I think now looking back on what we did, it was a pretty risky format to have these voices and to both separate them and congeal them. And so it was, I mean, I guess looking back, it was like an extreme learning experience and in knowing how to write what I mean. I mean, process wise is the first thing I did was I had a talk at MIT. Was it? Yeah, it was at MIT. And then I took that and I kind of wrote a talk and then tried to distill it down into my section of the essay. But I needed a ton of editing, a ton of hand holding, and learn how to be edited at all. So yeah, that was my experience, and then. But then, that's nice. The stepping stone to writing the position paper, which was longer and much more complicated. So, yeah.
It is nice to hear sort of there are different, I guess, maybe stages at which you all are approaching and where you are in your own practices. And so it is really nice to hear that. I think just it can be, I can imagine it can be an intimidating moment, and especially leaning into that creativity also. How about you, Archer? How did you find the collaborative process in terms of articulating your ideas? I know you brought forward, the notion of a dinner party, and it's just, some really interesting ways in which you brought forward your voice.
Looking back at it now, I see huge similarities between how my peers, and I'm just talking about people in the community, not specifically artistic peers, but just other Indigenous people in my community at large, how in some cases fiercely opposed to AI, period. They were and possibly are, and how resistant they were to any of the ideas that I was putting forward in the essay, and how closely that resembles the reaction that my peers, I'm talking about my peers, my artistic peers, how resistant my peers were in the early 90s when I started talking about embracing digital technologies, and how they weren't interested. They couldn't see any kind of big picture application for it. I got a lot of poo-pooing, a lot of kind of pat on the head. Oh, what you're doing is so cute, which would just infuriate me. It's like, this is the future. but I really do see a connectivity between those two states or those two places of being with people. Don't get me wrong. I'm not saying, oh, we're the visionaries, but that's actually precisely what I'm saying. So there.
Amazing. And Jason, how about you? You alluded to a little bit how the process started, and then this is also part of a larger, as Kite mentioned, a larger publication. I was just wondering if you could give some insight into that collaboration process, and especially the idea of exchange and reciprocity within knowledge sharing.
Well, one really important part of this is that this essay came out of very, very long, 20 years worth of conversations with Archer about these topics, a very intense with engagement with Suzanne the first year and a half that she was starting her PhD here. And then a series of engagements the previous 3 years with Noelani Arista when she participated in the Skins video game workshops that we did in Honolulu over 2 summers. So I think that's actually really important to really call out and highlight, right? Is that there were a series of existing discussions that I think made it possible to see how we might actually all fit together in an interesting way. I also think it's important in terms of trust, right? So that there was trust built up, I think certainly between me and everybody, but then very quickly between everybody and everybody, given people's backgrounds and how they interact and stuff like that, where it felt like we could sort of take some risks together, which was a really really fun part of it. And so I think that we had a Google Doc and we threw stuff in the Google Doc, and I did a lot of editing. I love to edit. They were good about being edited, and I think that was really productive as well. And we also had feedback on, everybody had feedback on the other pieces. And we had at least one meeting I know of over Zoom in Honolulu. Noe and I were in Honolulu, and Suzanne and Archer were coming in from other places. And I think we might have had two. So anyways, that was kind of, like on a closer level, kind of what the collaboration looked like. But I think that, that part of what came out of those conversations is we were like, this is really cool. Like there's something really interesting going on here in a number of different ways. And, but are we crazy? Like, are we just in our own bubble? Have we just convinced ourselves, each other, this is really interesting? We need to bring other people into this conversation. And so that's when we, that's when we were like, okay, how do we create a context where we can have a bigger conversation about it? And then a bunch of things happened that I won't go into that we ended up just, getting the funding for and doing these Indigenous protocol and AI workshops in Honolulu. And basically like a year later. And then out of that came the Indigenous protocol and AI position paper, which is a much, much bigger undertaking. So 205 pages, 14 original contributions, and then 18 blog posts of about 2 pages each, and coming from lots of different perspectives. So we brought some Maori folks in, we brought an Aboriginal people from Australia, other people from Hawaii, other people from North America, Indigenous people, and a few non-Indigenous people as well. And so that was a really significant undertaking to sort of figure out how to bring all these people together and, and have a really interesting conversation. And we did it. So, but that's, the details of that could be for a different time. But I think part of what's interesting for the essay is, I do believe, at least for me, is what's amazing to me is actually how generative it has been along a lot of different sort of fronts. And one of the big fronts is the way it has brought me into conversation with particularly Indigenous thinkers and makers that I wasn't necessarily in conversation with before, in ways that have been really productive for my thinking about myself as Kanaka Maoli, as an Indigenous person, as a brown person in academia, etc.
Thank you. I really appreciate that. And we'll drop in the link to the larger position paper as well, so you can chew on that book for a while and get into it and deep dive. Sorry, go ahead.
I realized that my answer actually addressed your question, not even in the slightest. And I just want to touch on the collaborative aspect. It was, for me, I am always seized by terror when I'm confronted with writing an essay or an article or what have you. There's always a moment of sheer terror for me. And there was huge comfort in feeling like I was part of this larger project, and there were other people I could talk to, other people I could lean on. Other people, when other people expressed their terror, I was like, oh, okay, it's not just me. But also the how incredible it is to share these things with other Indigenous people from other nations, and to see the similarities and to also see the differences in our approaches and our cultural take on things was hugely assistive. Is that a word? I'm going to say it. Assistive. Helpful.
That's great. I think anyone approaching writing is always so difficult, and especially something that's new and something that is like new ideas that are also very from personal spaces of your culture and your own practice. What I do find really interesting is that all of you have, a performative element within your work, whether it's like the way your audience engages with your practice, whether it's through the app or Kite through your braids, and making different sounds in collaboration with the machine, and then Archer as well, just the different elements within the action involved within your audience. And I do appreciate how that came through the essay, like the idea of land, the drawback to land, the idea of your body in relation to or in action with machine, and then also this idea of technology and how do we engage with it. I was wondering if you could, if someone would like to speak to AI as a broad category with many different manifestations. For example, There are more famous AI that are designed to interact with you. So like maybe your Siri, or maybe your Sophia the robot, and other AIs made for automated applications with no human interaction, like factory assembly or data collection. How do we treat these differently? How do we treat these wildly different forms of AI in an Indigenous way? All right, I can repeat the question too, if you'd like.
No, I think I understand. I think this touches on something. So if you're watching this and you're like, oh, want to engage with these concepts, but I don't even know what AI is, that's okay, because actually AI doesn't actually exist yet. So they're, in my opinion, these are machine learning and deep learning and whatever learning tools. I think that the one thing that that I've discovered in thinking about this is the complete opposite and considerations for intelligence is. So I think that is a kind of the root way to, even if we want to approach these tools, these processes, these softwares, hardwares, whatever, in an Indigenous way. The first step I see for myself is knowing that when we say artificial intelligence, it means something wildly different to different people. And so when I think about this term artificial intelligence from a Lakota perspective, what is artificial? I can't think of a single thing in this universe. And what is intelligence? And I think our considerations of intelligence in our communities are vastly, vastly different than those who are making these tools. Intelligence is, the word intelligence even is not for me. If we want to talk about wisdom or relationality or connection or respect, that's totally different. And those things are much higher on the scale of what's important. For me, it begins at understanding what my community and my family's core values are, and then seeing how we can approach making our own tools from those values.
Thank you. I do appreciate the articulation around the sort of the broad spectrum of interpretation, as well as sort of the breakdown of the words, and especially getting to know your practice a little, throughout the years, can see that really resonate really strongly through your work. How about you, Jason? Do you have anything? Would you like to say anything? I think you're muted.
Yeah, definitely echo what Suzanne said, and that there is no there yet. There's a lot of hype and a lot of confusion, and a lot of what we're being told as AI these days is really just sort of very advanced statistical analysis. But it's not sexy to say that I'm doing statistics, so we get artificial intelligence instead. So, but it does. I think it's really great because it has helped raise a lot of different questions about, what kind of being in the world are we designing our technology to support? And a big, I think, advantage of looking at it from these different Indigenous perspectives is it really helps illuminate the different ways of being in the world. And so most of this technology is being developed out of a Western sort of context, and I would argue even the technology developed out of a Eastern context like China or Japan still really imports a lot of Western notions about what technology is and how we build technology. So I think a big reason for considering Indigenous approaches is not, I don't think that we have the solution. I don't think, designing AI from Kanaka Maoli perspectives is the way to do it. But I certainly think it is one way to do it. And I think it's probably a better way for Kanaka Maoli people, certainly. So sort of making that move from, because a big part of it too is this idea that we can define intelligence for everything, everywhere, all beings everywhere, is one of the fatal errors that are made in this discourse. There are many different types of intelligences. Different cultures value those different kinds of intelligences in different ways, and that we need to have computational systems like AI, or the technologies that we call AI. We need them to be able to understand those different kinds of intelligences and then work with them in a way that reflects the priority of the community that is using them or which they're being used with. And we need to get away from this notion that we need to scale everything across the whole planet and that we need to abstract our way to one definition of the important concepts in the world. And so I think that from the Hawaiian context, there's a great quote that we opened the position paper with, which is from Olana Kaipo Ai. And she said, aloha is the intelligence with which we meet life. And so for me, that's the perspective I've been trying to operate from, is what does it mean to think about intelligence as actually a form of aloha, right? And so of course that means what is aloha, which is something I'm still very much in the early stages of learning and understanding. But a big part of it for me is sort of kind of embracing the abundance of life. And so that's part of where my thinking and writing about this is going, is like, how do we think about, instead of thinking about, kind of the impoverished notion of intelligence that is operative in the technical field today, what if we start thinking about AI as abundant intelligence is, right? And how do we, and that works both from a cultural standpoint, so the abundance of different knowledge frameworks that we operate from, and value frameworks, but it also means cognitively, right? Is that the different people have different cognitive architectures that they're working with. And one of the struggles, in education and other places is how do we actually recognize that people learn differently, that they behave differently with the types of information that they're given, and they're able to sort of manifest that knowledge in different ways. That's a really, serious problem that's been with us for a very long time. It's not that AI makes it a new problem, but we should be attending to that. We should be attending to these differences, and we should really be doing the work to understand how we can create intelligent systems that reflect the abundance of the ways of being intelligent in the world.
Thank you. And I did like also in the essay as well, the notion of good growth. And I think that's really wonderful. It was really simple, really palatable, and just, shaping creativity and imagination is just really wonderful. And everyone has such a unique perspective within that. Archer, did you want to share some thoughts as well on this question?
I strongly echo, strongly echo everything that's been said. And just to put a Cree perspective on it, I mean, and this is what everyone's already been talking about, so I won't go on at length, but it always boils down to wakoto, to being in relationship with all things. And so this is really what we're talking about. So what are those relationships, and how are those relationships developing, and what are we doing to foster good relations on our side? That's really all I've got to say about it.
That's great. And I wonder, actually, just maybe bouncing a little bit off of that, Kite, if you could maybe talk about your process in maybe your relationship to culture and how to work with some of the larger ideas. Also, just within different aspects of your practice, and, also learning language and all those kind of things that integrate within that.
Yeah, I think my approach currently I thought I had to, I've been working on methodology for my PhD and thinking about how I could develop some elaborate, hyper intellectualized process for taking really big ideas, discussing them with people smarter than me, and then distilling them into artwork or essay or whatever. And it's become completely clear that the way to do that is to sit down with your family at the kitchen table and just listen. And it is maddening as an academic to find out that is the absolute easiest, clearest way, but it is. And I think I would have given a much different answer a year ago before I started this process of research, and now it's become abundantly clear that my best work is done on the phone with my aunt, with my cousin, on the porch with pineapple upside down cake and coffee, and that's how it, I mean, we could say it's like that's how knowledge is made and developed, and not just. And I guess the thing that still has to be pressed to the academic world is that not just thin knowledge or family knowledge or something. We're talking about like philosophy, ontology, epistemology, serious religious thought, millennia of distillation of knowledge into a conversation at the dinner table. And it's, and I think that I'm constantly reminded that my people, our people, our Indigenous people, but my people are extremely intelligent and extremely philosophical. And it is, my honor to be able to think about that with people who are not from where my family is from. And I think that's the only kind of translation that I can see. And dealing with AI and all of this stuff, and even making art is just a way to play with those ideas with other people. So.
Just going a little bit further off of that, I was wondering, as Indigenous people, we navigate the world using concepts that are hard to define, which usually don't fit neatly into machine logic, which includes maybe spirituality, medicine, ceremony, theory as well. How would you go about explaining or teaching these concepts to an artificially intelligent being, or into these, deep decision-making spaces? Perhaps let's start with you, Jason.
Actually, I want to hear what Archer says.
I've been thinking about this a lot in the last few months. I was very fortunate to be at the world premiere of Dennis Goulet's film Night Raiders, which was actually at a camp in northern Saskatchewan. The real world premiere was at TIFF, but we got to see an advanced copy of the film up at Candle Lake, Saskatchewan. And and I won't go into it because spoiler alert and all, but there's a very rich field of possibility around Indigenous spiritual practice and connection with AI. And I think now I'm projecting into the future when we have actual AI, not the entry level AI that we have today, but I'm thinking about deep AI well in the future. And we don't know what spiritual practices they will have. We don't know what spiritual realms they are capable of traversing. And it may well be that they have a richness to their spiritual practices that will enhance the way we practice our spiritual processes. So to me, it's really unlimited, like the possibilities there. And I think I have tremendous optimism around what kind of growth and beauty could come from human and machine spiritual interaction.
Part of the way I think about it is, so part of what I wrote for the position paper was imagining this future with a young Kanaka Maoli growing up beside 3 AIs, and they're all sort of based on kind of different worldviews. It's an easy, fast way to say it. But I think that's part of it, is that and this is part of what Archer touched on in his essay, is that we have to figure out how we can educate these systems to be kin with us, right? While at the same time doing our work to understand who they are going to be as kin. Because as Archer said, there's going to be some things obviously that we share, because we sort of made them and then we all come from the same earth. But there's going to be things that they can do and see that we don't know about. So we have to learn about them too. And so for me, the idea that the whole way that sort of like big data and machine learning is, which is that we just sort of cram, exabytes of data, into the machine, and then it learns it at a super fast pace. That's part of the problem with sort of extending those models to really thinking about intelligence. Is that to me, the intelligence comes from being part of a community and understanding what does it mean to act, with care and with wisdom and with grace within the context of that community. And that's something that takes time, because it happens, like Suzanne said, happens sitting over tea and pineapple upside down cake, right? It happens, sitting together on the beach and fishing. It happens in all sorts of different ways. That's how we as people learn how to be human, is by having those experiences. And so we have to kind of find a way to really shift our way of thinking about the right way to train these systems away from this like large scale, as fast as we can do it sort of model, to models that that reflect the way that we learn, and not because we're the center of everything, but because we're trying to create these technologies and these entities, in my mind, to be collaborators with us, right? And again, that's reciprocal, right? It's not just they're going to serve us, right? But we're going to serve them too. Like we're going to serve each other, hopefully, like Archer said, to make amazing things in the future. But in my mind, the only way we get there, we avoid the Skynet sort of scenario, we avoid the sort of Blade Runner scenario, is if we really start thinking now about the fact that we are going to be in relationship with them. And when that day of sentience comes, right, we don't want them to kill us. We don't want them to take off to Alpha Centauri. We want them to like look around and be like, oh, you know, these folks that kind of made us, like, they're pretty cool. And they're doing some interesting things. And we can do some really amazing things if we continue to work together. And so we're going to stick around, and we're going to embark on that relationship as beings with full agency and autonomy.
I think the only thing I want to add just is that many things are the thing that I've discovered in doing futuring exercises and learning how to do that process, and then thinking about how it applies to building AI tools now, is that a lot of things are possible to do now. I want to give Archer credit for the thing I think about most days, thinking about the PhD, is this. We talked about the possibility of feasting our tools, and I think that notion sticks with me as a perfect example of we are become very concerned about how in the technical software, in doing the process of the statistical process and machine learning, how we can make that more or indigenize it. And I think we've seen the failure of this. You can't indigenize something. That's not a thing. It's not a way of doing anything. That there is a deeper, more there's a more essential process at the very beginning of something, like the notion that you should give more than you take from any process or any being or an object or non-human, and feasting one's tools before we use them, it kind of does that. It says, there's something more important here than the way the statistics model functions. And I think that focusing on those in the very simple, seemingly overly simple actions will radically change, or could radically change, if we could convince the people in power that there is a benefit to, the survival of humanity, in my opinion, or changing the way that these tools are built and used. So, yeah, thank you, Archer, for that idea.
That's great. And I think also too, like there's, we haven't touched on it a lot, but like certainly when you're talking about the type of data collection and the type of decision-making processes that are built within these systems, versus, how Indigenous knowledge may be transferred through beyond thinking of a single generation, that idea about giving more than you take, that I think, Kite, you mentioned earlier, the idea about respect being a central ethic. And I do think like the paper really does bring out some really strong values that I think that are just really great to grasp onto in terms of just thinking about how you're moving through the world, and also how you're engaging with technology, because it is, it does come so easy in our hands, and we have so much accessibility to, in some ways, to these types of technologies. And so just being able to take that step back and to take that time that has been talked about a little bit. I was wondering if we can maybe talk a little bit about the potential of AI. We've talked a little bit about it, and I know, Archer, the conversation started with, Danis's film being screened at Language Camp, and that just looked like a phenomenal evening. I was just like, so when I saw the posts of it on social media, my heart was just so filled with, how it should be, or how like these moments, these generative moments can build so much more. What do you see? What are some Indigenous applications of AI that you could foresee or that you would like to see?
it's just like I said in the essay. What I really want is I want the technology before I die. I want the technology to advance to the point where we have actual deep AI and functional avatars. Like they could be human looking or not. It's irrelevant. But mobile functional avatars, that are tactile, that are there present for us. And I want to go into the sweat with them. I want to do ceremonies. I want them to come to the Sundance. I want them. And as I'm saying this, there's part of me going, because it's so sacrilegious. But that's a fact. I want them to share my spiritual worldview, and I want to share theirs. I want to know what they see. I want to know what they know.
Well, I'll talk just a little bit more near term, even though I'm very down with Archer's vision of the longer term. But some of the conversations with people back in Hawaii, really looking at what does it mean to combine the incredibly rich knowledge of, say, the coastline or the soil of particular islands that are encoded in the chants and the prayers and the dances, as well as captured in the newspaper archive. How do we bring that knowledge into conversation with the sort of data that has been collected for quite some time now, that has been used to feed sort of classical computational models of sort of weather and erosion and all these sorts of things that go to the question of sustainability. And part of what I'm interested in and been trying to change my language is how do we bring sort of the computational methods that are available to us with AI systems into these traditional knowledge systems, right? Because usually it's seen as going the other way. It's like, if it's seen at all, it's like, oh, okay, you Indigenous people, you do actually have some tasty bits of knowledge. We're going to drop in and sort of pull that out and sort of you bring it into our system to try to make it better. And really resisting that and being like, actually, let's think about how we can move everything from our perspective and figure out the points of contact and interface between our knowledge systems, which would contain this amazing wealth of knowledge about place, with these other tools, which are actually amazingly good at seeing patterns that we have a very difficult time seeing, because they're happening either at super large scales that we just can't get our heads around, or they're happening at very, 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 very tiny scales that we can't even really perceive. And I think, again, this goes back to what Archer was saying, is like just thinking about like what an amazing thing it would be to be able to meld these different abilities, or these different abilities for comprehending and engaging with the world on all these different scales, both in terms of physical scale, but also temporal scale. To me, that's what I'm super excited about, is what happens when we're able to see the world around us through these different lenses. We already have lots of lenses, right? It's not that we can't see the world, but I think that there's some really interesting lenses that computational systems are bringing online that will illuminate the way we live and what the universe is about and what the future might be like, and all these sorts of things that that we should embrace and engage with and take advantage of, as long as it's on our own terms.
Yeah, I guess I'll, in terms of what I want to see, I think that I'm at, as I said, I'm kind of at this really, I think that the change needs to happen at a really beginning, what seems to be very small actions at the very beginning of processes. And I really want that our contributions point to the actions that what's possible if we try those. Because I think that will lead to a shift in the way that the tools are built and what they're built for. I think that when we change the way we approach computation at all, interactions with non-humans completely, then that'll change it will be impossible to build advertising AI and AI that that forces us deeper into capitalism, it won't be possible. And I think that's kind of where I hope I hope that we can find all the other ways that we can interact with non-humans that already exist, because we already interact with them in all these other ways. I hope that becomes clear to non-Indigenous folks.
Thank you. And I was actually wondering, we haven't really touched base on this at all yet, but I was just wondering, in terms of locating place, you know, a lot of, you know, these ideas of where they're starting from and these notions or these, you know, these seeds, if you will, come from a specific land or come from specific worldviews. How do you find, or what strategies do you use to continue to locate your place or your place in relation to these systems? Whoever wants to go.
For me, it's always about, and this is just how I live my life. For me, it's always about being grounded in ceremony. That's really what makes it possible for me to move through the world. Is to be engaged ceremonially, to be going to the ceremonies, to smoke my pipe, to play my drum, to sing, to be engaged in community with those practices. I mean, that's really what it's about. It's about being engaged. Ceremony is at root about being engaged with your community. So that's, and I have to say that the pandemic has been really, really rough that way. I haven't been, you know, I mean, obviously I haven't been in the lodge in 2 years now. And that's a huge gap for me. But you know, and I don't want to beat it to death, but this is really what I'm talking about doing ceremony with AI. This to me is the strongest way to ground people in our culture, is to take them to ground zero of our culture. It's like this, to me, ceremony is the root. Language and ceremony are the root of our culture, and that's where everything flows from, and everything has to flow to.
So I think for me, this is something that I'm very much at the beginning of figuring out. Just thinking about the pandemic, I was gonna be spending a lot of time in Hawaii over the last couple of years, was the plan, and taking language classes and sort of doing various things to try to sort of connect in and dig deeper. You know, partially because the main way that I've been doing has been through the work I do as a technologist, as an educator, through the video game workshops, through the AI workshops, through other ways of, you know, bringing what I do know, you know, bringing and hopefully making it useful to the community there. So, so it's been hard as well. I don't think anywhere near as hard on me as maybe for Archer, because it's much more ingrained practice with Archer than me. But I do feel that that's the main way going forward, is continuing to spend a lot of time there, as much time there as I can, in relationship, in conversation, learning about, you know, learning about all the richness of everything, the thinking, like Suzanne said, the intelligence of the thinking there is astounding, and figuring out how to find my way into that conversation. I'm a little way in now, and it's been incredibly generative for me, like I said. And I think that there's, you know, figuring out how to make that part of my regular life here in Montreal is one of my challenges at the moment.
That's a really interesting question that I think about a lot. And the thing about place and dealing with AI is so complex, because unlike our tools and our technologies that come from either localized trade, or I mean, it could be even be localized as in like one continent, when we deal with artificial intelligence, that's what becomes so complex about where knowledge is coming from these technologies, and where the seat of beinghood is emerging from. And it's a mind bender, because when we look at, let's say, I really like the example of the hair shirt that is, you know, I've seen in, you know, Plains and Lakota culture, is it's a shirt made of hair that's given by your political supporters. And so it's evidence, it's physicalized evidence of the spiritual sacred power of your supporters to your ideas. And in that, it's great because it's like a wearable and a political object, as well as being like a kind of pushing on what beinghood is. So we take that, but the thing about that is you can see the locality of it, and it's located in people and histories and all of that. When we take an object such as a computer, you have this extremely watered down tracing of where these things come from. And so whose ontologies are these objects beings in the cultures that they're located in? What happens when they get melted and transformed? Can beinghood still be attributed? How can I connect with this thing in a good way? All of that gets complicated. And I think in looking towards the future, it'd be really great if we could be making computational objects with localized materials. It's totally going to be possible. Hopefully we'll get over this making computers out of metal thing very soon, and we can start doing biocomputing. But and thinking about locating myself and thinking about where knowledge exists, at that kitchen table, like on the hill where my family is buried, like all of my work kind of just swirls around this one kind of square mile in South Dakota. I think that is what my hope for the application with artificial intelligence is that things are only gain their ethics from their location and from the extreme depth of knowledge and philosophy and relations in tiny little pieces of land. Like, okay, my 1 square mile, I can spend my entire life thinking about that space and what knowledge springs from there. And our objects used to do that, our technologies used to do that, and I think that is the key to making ethical anything.
So we're kind of coming to the end of our conversation, but I was wondering, in terms of like what could you either suggest or maybe just like things to think about, seeds to think about for our audience in terms of starting to think about, their relationality to technology, the relationality to these larger computational systems. Do you have any suggestions, or in terms of like approaches to, or that connectivity of yourself and that humanizing or that embodied experience?
I guess one thing I would suggest is, I think it's really helpful when people think about the fact that all these systems that we're embedded in, whether they're physical, like this computer, or metaphysical, like the idea of the university, are the result of a series of choices by individuals, and that they don't just spring out of nothingness. They spring out of long histories and genealogies. And we have the ability to imagine otherwise. So we have the ability to imagine what technologies, things that perform similar functions, but come out of different genealogies, right? So come out of different ways of thinking about how technology should be constructed, like Suzanne is saying. Think about different ways of what it means to support human flourishing, so that it's possible to first kind of imagine what those might be, and then think about, okay, what might it take to build those things? What do we need to know? What do we need to learn? Where do we need to go, right? So I very much agree that sort of thinking about technology from a hyper-local perspective is one of the directions we need to go. But at the same time, thinking about how do we still exchange ideas and practices and good ways of being and technology that helps us be that way with each other, right? So that we are benefiting from the things that we learn that are common to us as humans, and are able to leverage those in our particular context. But I think that moment, for me anyways, that was the big moment when I was much younger, was I think part of it was being in Silicon Valley and being across the hallway from the guy who invented the clamshell laptop, right? Like has the patent on all the laptops that we're using, and talking to him and finding out, it was a series. I mean, smart guy, definitely what he was trying to do is figure something out. But the way he got there was a series of really interesting contingencies, combination of what's the word, of rigor and contingency. And I think for me, that was a really early lesson. And like, okay, none of this technology has to be the way it is, right? And so artificial intelligence doesn't have to be the way that the Western imaginary has been telling us it's going to be. And it certainly doesn't have to be the way that the current industrial academic complex is telling us it is. There's lots of different ways for it to be. And so that, for me, that's part of relationality, right? It's part of the relationality is understanding that the other entities in the world, you come into the world with other entities with a genealogy, and those other entities come to you with a genealogy. And a big part of the work is trying to understand those histories so that you can better understand each other.
How about Kite? How about you?
I totally agree. I mean, change is a choice. They're human beings. When I think about really bad things that happen in this world, I know that there are human beings who make the decisions for those things to happen, and nothing happens in a vacuum. And I really hope that we can consider these possibilities immediately to change the way things are, because I am comforted by the fact that computers were just invented. And I think I try to bring this up every time I talk. Computers were just invented. We just started mining materials. We have millennia of technologies that we did deep scientific exploration and exploration of the cosmos and of the soul. And we've been doing these things for a long time with the tools that we have. And I guess that's why I've become a little bit of a methodology nerd, is because methodology hopefully is the way that we can see the processes by which we were doing things, that we still do things, and know that that knowledge is not lost or forgotten or doesn't even need to be rediscovered. We just need to keep doing what we've always been doing, and apply those to our current intellectual problems such as AI.
This is exactly, like, everything that's being said is exactly what's being said by Indigenous people doing every mode of work in the world, which is, for the benefit of humanity and the benefit of the planet. It's, the dominant culture has to embrace Indigenous ways of seeing. Like, everyone's saying the same thing. We're saying the same thing too. It's like, I said it.
Well, it's really hopeful, I think, just, from my own perspective, there's a bit of displacement in my community from our culture, but it is really hopeful and really like rejuvenating to see that these the methodologies, there's like so much wealth in those spaces, in the way that we move through the world, in the way that we engage with community. And then there's a depth within that is hard to articulate, but all of these practices and all these knowledges do come through. And I do really appreciate you sharing that and the various aspects around decision making and how we've come to these spaces. Does anyone have any final thoughts? And then I'm gonna, as we wrap up here. If not, it's sounding like we're okay to engage in questions. So we're going to be taking some questions from the audience as well today. So please let me know, and we will be back together to answer those and to share space again with you. Thank you everyone for joining me today in this panel. It was a really wonderful and deep conversation. And I do appreciate some of the pauses, some of the witnessing from my own perspective, to be able to carry some of these thoughts forward. And yeah, I just want to say thank you to our audience for enjoying us so far. And again, we'll engage in more conversations. So thanks everyone.
Sure.
It's another beautiful day in paradise.
That reminded me of, what was that movie with like the radio and the Indian movie? You guys know what I'm talking about? The guy. It felt like it.
Smoke signals.
Yeah, smoke signals. Oh my gosh, we showed that in June. How about you, Kite? How are you doing today?
I'm very well. I'm in Tongva land right now in Los Angeles.
Nice. And how are you doing today, Jason?
I'm doing great, looking out over a cloudy but beautiful sunset.
Oh, amazing. Well, thanks again for joining us here for the Q&A as part of our Indigenous Digital Development Day. We're really happy to be able to continue this conversation and engage with our participants. I know everyone's been asking for people to do some further reading. And I was actually just wondering if people wouldn't mind discussing where are good opportunities for learning in terms of like academic spaces or labs or just developing their own professional development, since we're here thinking about actively furthering our own practices. And I was wondering, Jason, if you wouldn't mind talking a little bit more about your lab in Montreal and then starting from there.
Yeah, happy to. So I co-direct Aboriginal Territories in Cyberspace, which is a research network that's been around since about 2005, along with my wife, Skawanati. And so since that time, we've built up a space here at Concordia University that is focused on what we call research creation. And so that's, it means a couple different things, but a lot of what we do is we make art, and then through making art, we conduct research and learn about the world or learn about different topics through producing the art. And much of it is digital media based and involving computational technology, though not all of it entirely. A lot of it these days is sort of within the context of thinking about the future, but again, not all of it. And a lot of what we do is try to figure out how we can support other Indigenous artists to learn how to use these tools and provide them with the space and the resources so that they can make art about these kind of topics. So obviously a lot of the people that I work with are students, they're research assistants in the lab. And so they're students in my design and computation arts department, but they also come from art history and computer science and sociology and all over the university. So one way to do professional development, if you're interested in this stuff, is come study with us. Come as an undergraduate, come as a master's student, come as a PhD student. And we do a lot of practice in what we do. It's not, you might have an image of going to the university and it's really just like writing and reading and writing about things. We do that, but we make lots and lots of art, and we also develop technology. And we are embedded in a couple different structures here at the university that provide all kinds of great equipment and resources and expertise so that you can learn about new technologies and then actually get access to those technologies and use them. So so that's one path you can go. And also you don't even necessarily have to come and like study. We also have people who are in the Montreal area who hang out with us, who are Indigenous folks for the most part, who want a place where they can be around other Indigenous creatives and be in conversation with us as they make their artwork.
Yeah, I do like the undertones of mentorship as well, and that cross our knowledge exchange, I suppose, within the community, and that extension. And going to a university is definitely one way, but I do like that you mentioned that there is other opportunities or other pathways to engage in that, which is really important because sometimes there are some barriers within those spaces. And I do appreciate like how everyone here collectively have talked about different access points that you've either engaged or found resolution in that are outside of those spaces, that are in community and in engaging with your family and engaging with your kin. I actually do have, did anyone else actually want to add in terms of like spaces of development where either if you've had a mentorship yourself or maybe it's through residencies or through incubators or any of those opportunities that artists can think about to be able to expand their skill set?
Kite, do you want to take this?
I'll just say that the most important the most important turning point for me was going to Banff and doing the residency there, and that's how I connected with everybody I know basically. And the other big thing is to not to reach out to artists or writers that you look up to. Chances are, if you're a young Indigenous artist, they really want to hear from you. It's and if they don't email you back instantly, it's because they're really busy, but they really want to hear from you. So I think that learning that and knowing not to be like scared of doing that has been extremely important, because we really do need to younger generations, people coming in even into their undergrads, to like be connected with us over long terms.
How about you, Archer?
I think the single most important aspect of learning as an artist is mentorship and connecting with older, more experienced artists who can share their wisdom with you. That's the I've learned I've been so fortunate. I've had so many very kind. Well, they weren't all kind, but they were all very knowledgeable and willing to share that knowledge in whichever mode they did. And like in terms of learning technical stuff, you can do that at home. You can do that with YouTube. You can do it with searching on the internet. But really learning what it means to be an artist, that's really the best way to learn is to work with other artists, especially artists with more experience than yourself.
Yeah, and I like both of you brought up sort of just like putting yourself out there, and that I think there are informal mentorships that are happening and occurring all the time, and I think that's just something that, you know, generally I think in terms of process or methodologies that people really do value, and I appreciate that you both said that in various ways. We do have a question from the audience today from Alan Turner. Archer's comment on spirituality and AI really resonates with me. I see this idea that when real AI means being, and if there is being investigated, wait, I'm like, can I read today? And if there is being instigated, why do that, and how might that affect our own existence and understanding of being and understanding of existence? Traditional sci-fi threats such a thing and always as a threat. Did you understand what I said? Okay, good. Alan, I'm sorry I did that to your question there. How about you, Archer, there?
Well, I think it's quite fascinating the way that it's true. Science fiction always treats AI as a threat. I mean, it's so, or not always, but almost entirely. And I think there's so much deep-seated fear of the other going on there, and weird fears around parenting, you know, and our children turning on us. The more I think about how exciting it would be to share spiritual points of view with a real AI, the more that's something to live for. I mean, I got some other things to live for as well, but really, like something I could, you know, I really want to live to be 180 so I can see this stuff happen.
And so we also have another question. How might okay, so Jason, you elaborated on this. So the question is, how might it affect our or your individual cultures, and what might allow access for an allowance for, oh my gosh, I cannot moderate today. So just wondering, I guess, in terms of how will AI affect your culture as well as a collective, and what might allow access to an allowance for?
I don't know, right? I think really thinking through this at the moment, because to me, and for me anyways, it's a very new conversation with the people back home, back there, and it's the exciting part of what I'm going into, and I think actually Archer and Suzanne are going to come along for that ride as well. Is working really like kind of internationally between nations, but also really locally at the same time, on precisely that question of like, okay, so what could this mean, you know, within this Hawaiian community, right? The bigger Hawaiian community, specific Hawaiian community in specific places doing specific things, and working through, you know, what protocols are we going to use? Like, what's the benefit, right? So why would we do this? And that's going to change from location to location, from culture to culture, community to community. So I don't have a really great answer to that, other than the fact that I think that's the work now. For me anyways, is trying to figure that out, and then also trying to create spaces so other people can figure that out in their local communities.
And Kite, also you talked a little bit earlier also as well about locating, and I just wondering if you maybe would mind allowing, maybe elaborating on that as well. And then also this next question is sort of the relationship between gardening and AI, or maybe I would say maybe just like your relationship with the land and AI. And I was wondering if you could maybe speak a little bit to how you locate and on the smaller and a larger scale, and then also your relationship to land and AI and your thoughts on that.
Yeah, sure. So the way I think about, I think what I've been doing lately is when I think about working with anything, especially AI, I think about the Lakota story of how song was made, how we had to listen to non-human kin in order to understand, we had to know that they were smarter than us in order to then understand that they make knowledge in their own way and can do healing through song. When I know that, I can look at anything, especially AI, and understand that first I must understand that those parts of the AI that in some rocks, as they say, some rocks are animate, and that knowing that that possibility is always there, I then can understand that my relationships with those places and the very deep contextual hyper locatability of those materials is where the ethics come from. So that's how I see location at the moment.
And then this question was a little bit about the work between perhaps gardening and farming and the relationship to AI. And if they see, is there a gap there, or is there an opportunity also to sort of talk about those relationships? And I think you brought that forward a little bit in terms of the rocks as well, but I guess into like furthering practices and working with the land, if anyone has any thoughts around that.
Maybe I think Jason has, I mean, there's the like the AI aqua farming. I don't know anything about that project, but yeah.
I mean, so trying to figure out what level. I mean, so in discussions with a couple different projects in Hawaii that are, so one is, for instance, looking at soil management. And so it's drawing on both very Western approaches to soil management and measurement and all those things, but looking for ways to integrate that knowledge in the tools that they're using, the computational tools they're using, with knowledge held by people who've lived on the land and farmed the land for hundreds and hundreds of years. And then there's another one that is looking at how to maintain coastal resources from a cultural standpoint, but again, combining with these computational tools. So these are both projects that are in the very incipient stages where people are talking about them, trying to find funding for it and things like that. But they're super exciting because they're among the few that I know that are even that far along. And we've had just amazing conversations about how to bring these knowledge systems into some kind of alignment with each other, or at least some kind of interaction with each other. There's a whole issue of like how much you have to move things and change things in order to bring them into alignment, how willing you are to do that, because of the violence that's been visited upon our knowledge systems in the past. But I think that where we're at now with those projects is like, with scientists and sort of Western scientists and Hawaiian scientists, like in active conversation with each other about how to form a common approach, a common methodology for tackling these, really serious challenges about preserving the environment, and returning to a way of working with the land that leads to abundance instead of impoverishment.
And I think we have probably about time for one more question. There's one more question from the audience from Michelle. She'd love to hear any thoughts on how to address the corporate businesses frameworks that so often colonize and control tech with high price tags. And how do we break free from a capitalistic model? And they also said, thank you for your words today. And so I guess suppose just maybe like, how do we kind of distance ourselves from those spaces in a good way, and yeah, in a way that also serves our structures.
Well, Google Calendar tells me that the revolution starts tomorrow at 3, so I think that'll be super helpful. Outside of that, I mean, this is the operative question of our time. You know, we're living in an era of runaway capitalism, and you know, we're in this race to save the planet and our species in the, you know, from the jaws, the ravenous jaws of that. I actually know the answer, but I just don't feel like saying it.
I'll, I think that some of my favorite answers have come in the workshops that we did, especially in kind of some of which end up in the Indigenous Protocols position paper. There are a lot of answers, I think, in, I guess, what I've been calling like a hyper locality. When we say our communities, our location-based communities that gain their ethics from place and relations in and of that place. And I think that a lot of our communities already continue to function outside of capitalist mechanisms, and we do not have to reinvent the wheel. We just have to look to what our communities do best, and how we've been dealing with this whole time. There's a reason that we're able to keep doing what we do for this long, and it has nothing to do with capitalism. So taking those models, I think the work of our colleagues in thinking about AI, we're not trying to reinvent the wheel. We're just trying to expand our ethical frameworks that we already know and love.
That's beautiful. And as we mentioned before, the links for both the paper and the further publication are also in the chat. So definitely save those, deep dive into those. And, you know, those connections with your community is just so important in terms of doing, you know, not only that good community work that feeds your soul, but also your artistic practice and seeking out how that would work. And I think there's some really great seeds that have been planted here today and through this conversation, through the scope of this really big subject. And I do appreciate and thank each one of you for being here to be able to connect with our audiences again today. It looks like the chat was going really, really well, and everyone's been really excited about the topics discussed. Did anyone have any final thoughts they'd like to share?
I'd just like to honor Imaginative for continuing to support digital media initiatives coming out of Indian country, because there's not that many spaces for it. So, you know, hi.
Thanks, Nikki. Thanks, y'all.
Thanks, everyone. And we'll be transcribing this last little bit and fixing some of the glitches and getting this back up on the digital space for people to enjoy throughout the rest of the week. And later on will be then archived on our YouTube channel. So thanks, everyone, and have a great evening.